The streets of any city have their dangerous corners. People know to avoid certain places, certain situations, certain strangers. The advice is always the same. Be careful who you trust. Be aware of your surroundings. Stay safe. But every single woman on this list today took a life not in some dark alleyway as a stranger, but in a bedroom, a kitchen, a block of flats, a park, a basement, a flat where someone had let them through the door. These were neighbours, wives, girlfriends, mothers, and teenagers. Women who looked completely ordinary to everyone around them. Women whose crimes shocked not just Sheffield, but the entire country. Some planned what they did for weeks. Some acted in a single moment of rage that lasted for hours. Some recruited others to do it for them. All of them are now serving time, some for decades, some for the rest of their natural lives. Today we are covering Sheffield and Yorkshire's most notorious female criminals and the sentences that followed. Case 1. Sarah Barrass. Sarah Barrass was a 35-year-old mother living in a terraced house on Gregg House Road in Shire Green, a residential area in the north of Sheffield. On the morning of Friday, 24th May 2019, police were called to her home after neighbours raised concerns about the children inside. When officers arrived, they found 6 children unconscious in the property. 2 of them, Blake Barrass, aged 14, and Tristan Barrass, aged 13, were taken to Sheffield Children's Hospital, where they later passed away. The 4 surviving children were treated for the effects of medication they had been given without their knowledge. Sarah Barrass and a man named Brandon Machin were arrested at the scene. What followed was one of the most disturbing court cases Sheffield had ever seen. To the outside world, the Barrass household looked completely ordinary. Neighbours and people who knew the family described Sarah as a devoted single mother, raising 6 children largely on her own. Brandon Machin, her half-brother, was a regular presence at the home and was seen by most people as a supportive family member helping out where he could. The children believed their father had passed away. That was the story they had been told their entire lives. None of the children knew the truth, and neither did anyone else in the community. Social workers, teachers, neighbours, none of them had any idea what was really happening behind the front door of that house on Gregg House Road. The reality was that Brandon Machin was not just Sarah's half-brother, he was also the biological father of all 6 of her children. The 2 had been in a secret relationship for years, and the children had been born as a result of that relationship. A note found on Sarah's phone during the investigation confirmed this directly. It read that Brandon was the father of all the children. The children had grown up believing an entirely different version of their own family history, and the people who were supposed to protect them had constructed that false reality deliberately to protect themselves. The situation began to unravel in the months before May 2019. Allegations of harmful behaviour involving Blake had been made to social services, and an investigation had begun. Similar concerns were later raised about Tristan. Sarah became increasingly panicked about what would happen if social services became more deeply involved. She feared the children would be taken into care. More than that, she feared the truth about her relationship with Brandon would be exposed. The 2 of them began to communicate about what they were going to do. Messages recovered from Sarah's phone showed the state of her thinking during this period. In one message, she wrote that she loved her children too much to let them go into care. On the evening of 23rd May 2019, Sarah received a phone call from someone in the local area, saying they were going to report another alleged incident involving Tristan to social services. That phone call appears to have been the moment the plan moved from thought into action. That same night, Sarah and Brandon gathered medication from around the home, including prescribed tablets, and divided them among the 4 oldest children, encouraging them to take the pills. The intention was that the children would not survive. When that failed and the children remained alive, Sarah and Brandon moved to the 2 eldest boys. Blake and Tristan were strangled. Sarah used the cord from her dressing gown to strangle Tristan. Brandon strangled Blake with his hands. After both boys had been harmed further to ensure they would not survive, Sarah took the 4 younger children to a bedroom and called the police herself. When officers arrived, they found a scene that investigators would later describe as one of the most harrowing they had ever attended. All 6 children were unconscious. Emergency services worked at the scene before transporting the children to Sheffield Children's Hospital. Blake and Tristan never recovered. The 4 younger children survived. Sarah and Brandon were arrested at the property. When officers spoke to Sarah at the scene, she made a statement that was later repeated in court. She told them she would rather see her children gone than in care. She also said she had given them life and that she could take it away. The investigation that followed was led by South Yorkshire Police. Forensic work, phone evidence, and analysis of the messages between Sarah and Brandon built a detailed picture of what had happened and why. Both were charged with 2 counts of taking a life, 5 counts of attempted harm to another person, and 1 count of conspiracy to harm all 6 children. At Sheffield Crown Court on 27 September 2019, both Sarah Barrass and Brandon Machin entered guilty pleas to all charges. Neither offered any account during the court proceedings that contradicted the evidence against them. Sentencing took place on the 12th of November 2019 before Judge Mr. Justice Goss. The court heard from the prosecution that the couple had acted out of fear, specifically fear of losing the children to care and fear of their secret being discovered. The judge did not accept that as justification for anything that had occurred. Sarah's defence barrister told the court that her client had experienced a profoundly damaging childhood herself, including abuse, and that this had shaped who she became. The judge acknowledged that background, but made clear it did not reduce what she had done. Brandon Machin received no separate mitigation that changed the outcome. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 35 years before either could be considered for release by the parole board. At the time, it was one of the longest minimum terms ever handed down in South Yorkshire. The house on Gregg House Road, where Blake and Tristan lost their lives, has since been demolished. The housing association that owned the property applied for planning permission to knock it down and create a small memorial space on the site, including a memorial tree. The local community supported the proposal. Planning permission was granted in July 2020, and the house was demolished on February 17, 2021. The space where it once stood now exists as a quiet memorial to the 2 boys who grew up there, believing they were loved and protected. What makes the next case on this list so striking is that, unlike Sarah Barrass, who hid her crimes behind the image of a caring home, the woman you are about to hear about carried out her offending completely openly, earning a nickname in her own neighbourhood that should have been a warning to everyone around her, a warning that nobody took seriously until it was far too late. Case 2. Allison Moss. Allison Moss was 46 years old and lived in a flat on Fox Walk in Walkley, a residential area in the west of Sheffield. She had a partner named David Webster, who was 49 and lived nearby in Hillsborough. The 2 were in a relationship and spent a significant amount of time together. The man who lost his life in August 2016 was 47-year-old Craig Wild, described by everyone who knew him as popular, warm, and the kind of person who made a room better just by being in it. His family and friends remembered him as the life and soul of any gathering, someone who made people laugh without even trying. Craig and Allison Moss knew each other. He was part of the same social circle and had been to her flat before. That familiarity was part of what made what happened so difficult for those who loved him to process. Craig Wild had his own history with Allison Moss that the court later heard about in detail. At some point before August 2016, Moss had attacked Craig with a knife during a previous encounter. That attack was serious enough that Craig gave her a nickname because of it. He called her the Slasher. Despite that, Craig continued to be around Moss socially. On the evening of 25th August 2016, Craig was at Moss's flat on Fox Walk along with David Webster. The 3 of them had been drinking and taking substances together. At some point during the evening, an argument broke out. What followed was an attack that South Yorkshire Police later described as brutal and without any provocation whatsoever. Webster and Moss attacked Craig together inside the flat. The weapons used included a Stanley knife, a kitchen knife, and a screwdriver. Craig was also punched, kicked, and stamped on during the attack. A post-mortem examination carried out after his passing confirmed that Craig had sustained 117 separate injuries across his body. Half of those injuries were described by pathologists as slash wounds. The attack continued for a sustained period, and when neighbours heard what was happening and called the police, officers arrived to find a scene they described as horrific. Craig was still alive when help arrived, but died from his injuries. Webster made no attempt to hide what had happened. He told officers at the scene that he had made sure Craig was gone and told them what he had planned to do with the body had police not arrived when they did. The investigation was led by South Yorkshire Police. Forensic examination of the flat, along with analysis of clothing and footwear recovered from both Moss and Webster, produced significant evidence. Forensic experts were able to show, through DNA and blood evidence on the shoes and clothing of both defendants, that Moss had participated directly in the attack on Craig. This became central to the case because Moss had a very different version of events. She told investigators and later the jury that she had played no part in what happened. Her account was that she had sat on the sofa throughout the entire attack, covering her face with her hands. She claimed she had tried to escape and slipped on blood, falling onto Craig as she did so. She denied touching him at all in any harmful way. The case went to trial at Sheffield Crown Court. Webster pleaded guilty to the attack on Craig before the trial began, meaning the jury only had to consider the case against Moss. Prosecutors presented the forensic evidence, the accounts from attending officers, and the testimony of experts who said that the evidence found on Moss's shoes and clothing could not be explained by her account of events. The jury also heard about the attack Moss had carried out on a 17-year-old in January 2016, just months before Craig's passing. In that incident, Moss had invited a teenager and a 16-year-old girl back to her flat before shouting at the teenager that he needed to cut for the devil and that she was the devil. She then attacked him with a cutthroat razor, leaving him with serious wounds to his head and arm. A dog in the flat also attacked the teenager during the incident. After an 8-day trial, the jury found Allison Moss guilty of taking Craig Wilde's life. She showed no reaction in the dock when the verdict was read out. The following day, 2nd March 2017, both Moss and Webster appeared at Sheffield Crown Court for sentencing before Mr. Justice David Holgate. The judge told them both directly that Craig Wilde had suffered the most brutal, savage, and sustained attack that resulted in his passing, and that he had experienced a significant period of mental and physical suffering before he lost his life. Webster was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years and 2 months. Moss, whose minimum term was set higher because of the additional offence involving the teenager, was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 29 years. She also received a 10-year concurrent sentence for the attack on the 17-year-old. Webster remained completely expressionless throughout the sentencing hearing and was seen by those in the public gallery to smile at one point before being taken down. Moss appealed her sentence after conviction. The appeal was heard before the Vice President of the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. The court rejected the appeal entirely and upheld the life sentence with the minimum term of 29 years. The prosecution barrister who had led the original trial also represented the prosecution in the appeal hearing. South Yorkshire Police Detective Chief Inspector Dave Stopford, who led the investigation, said after the original sentencing that both Moss and Webster were extremely dangerous individuals who had taken the life of a defenceless man without any provocation. A statement from Craig's family described the impact of losing him as one of total devastation and said that having to sit through the details of a trial while Moss maintained her innocence had made an already unbearable situation even harder to endure. Allison Moss is currently serving her sentence. She will not be eligible to be considered for release until she has served a minimum of 29 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The woman in the next case also targeted someone within her own immediate world, but unlike the chaos of that August night in Walkley, what happened on a summer evening in Sheffield in 2020 began with a single knock on a neighbour's door and ended with that neighbour bleeding out in the hallway of a block of flats, while her attacker walked calmly down the street. Case 3. Carrie Taylor. Pearl Simone Hancock was 55 years old and lived in a block of flats on Ravenscroft Place in Sheffield. Her family and friends knew her as Simone. She was a mother and a grandmother, described by those closest to her as a warm and caring woman. Carrie Taylor was 41 years old and lived in the same block of flats. The two women were neighbours. On the evening of Saturday, 4th July 2020, Simone Hancock was in the communal hallway of the building when she was attacked from behind. She was stabbed multiple times in the upper back and shoulders with a large knife. A post-mortem examination later confirmed she also had a wound to her head and defensive injuries on her hands, showing she had tried to protect herself during the attack. Paramedics arrived and treated her at the scene before taking her to hospital, where she passed away shortly after arriving. Carrie Taylor was already gone by the time police reached the block of flats. Taylor had a criminal history that stretched back years before that night. In 2004, she had been sentenced to 3 years and 9 months in prison after being convicted of kidnap and robbery. She also had previous convictions for possession of an offensive weapon in a public place and assault. At the time she attacked Simone, she was 41 years old and living on Ravenscroft Place, the same address as her neighbour. There was no evidence presented at trial that a significant relationship existed between the two women. Simone's family confirmed they had not known Taylor to have any connection to Simone personally, with one of Simone's relatives telling the court they had never even seen the two together. After the attack, Taylor left the scene. At around 11:05 on the night of 4th July, a member of the public walking on No Hill Place nearby noticed the woman in the street who was bleeding from her hand. That woman was Taylor. She told the person she had stabbed someone and then ran away. The member of the public contacted the police. Officers searched the area and found discarded items of clothing along the route Taylor had taken. Around 30 minutes after that first call, further reports came in from members of the public, saying they had seen a woman walking along Sheffield Parkway covered in blood. Officers searched that area and eventually found Taylor on Manor Lane. She was arrested and taken into custody. The investigation that followed was led by South Yorkshire Police. Evidence gathered at the scene, including forensic work in the communal hallway and on the clothing found discarded nearby, built a strong case. Other residents in the block of flats had heard Simone calling out that she had been hurt, with some neighbours reporting hearing her shout Taylor's name. The cause of Simone's passing was confirmed as multiple significant stab wounds to her upper back and shoulders. Prosecutors described the attack as sustained and ferocious, noting the force used was severe enough that part of a bone in Simone's arm was detached during the assault. More than a litre of blood left her body after one of her lungs was punctured. Taylor was charged with taking Simone's life and appeared at Sheffield Crown Court. She entered a not guilty plea and denied responsibility for what had happened. Over the course of an 8-day trial, the prosecution presented the forensic evidence, the accounts of witnesses who had seen Taylor in the street shortly after the attack, the discarded clothing found along her route, and the testimony of residents from the block of flats. Taylor's defence argued that she had experienced a loss of control at the time of the attack. The prosecution rejected that argument, and the jury ultimately agreed with them. After deliberating for 3 hours and 18 minutes, the jury returned a unanimous verdict of guilty. The sentencing took place at Sheffield Crown Court before Judge Peter Kelson. He identified several factors that made the offence more serious than it might otherwise have been. Taylor had used a weapon. The attack was sustained rather than a single moment of sudden action. After the attack, she behaved in a way that caused another person to fall under suspicion, which the judge noted as a significant aggravating factor on top of everything else. The judge also pointed to her use of racially offensive language directed at Simone after her arrest, which was treated as an additional aggravating circumstance. Her previous criminal record, including the earlier conviction for kidnap and robbery and the possession of an offensive weapon, also worked against her during sentencing. The starting point under sentencing guidelines for a case of this nature was 15 years. Taking all the factors into account, the judge set a minimum term above that level. Taylor was sentenced to life imprisonment and told she must serve a minimum of 18 years before she could be considered for release by the parole board. Speaking after the sentencing, the officer in charge of the investigation said Taylor had refused to accept responsibility for her actions, which had meant that Simone's family had been forced to sit through the full details of a trial and hear exactly what happened to their mother and grandmother in her final moments. The officer praised the jury for their work and said the result reflected the weight of evidence placed before the court. Simone's family did not make a public statement after the verdict, but had been present throughout the trial. Carrie Taylor is currently serving her sentence. Simone Hancock's family were left without a mother and grandmother because of what happened on a summer evening in a block of flats in Sheffield. Simone had done nothing to provoke what was done to her. She was simply at home, in the building she lived in, on an ordinary Saturday night. The next case involves two women rather than one, and unlike Carrie Taylor, who acted alone, what happened in Woodseats in 2023 was a joint act carried out by neighbours who targeted one of the most vulnerable people in their building, a man who had no idea what was coming until it was already too late to stop it. Case 4. Zoe Ryder and Nicola Lethbridge. Stephen Mark Kozicharski was 60 years old and lived alone in a flat on Fraser Drive in Woodseats, a quiet residential area in the south of Sheffield. People who knew him described him as a kind and gentle man who would help anyone who needed it. His close friend of 38 years, Mary Jones, later told the court that Stephen was a special person with a heart of gold who had been nothing but good to everyone around him throughout his entire life. Stephen had a mild learning difficulty. He also lived with several serious medical conditions, including heart disease, epilepsy and diabetes, and had previously undergone heart surgery. He was, by every account given to the court, a quiet man who kept to himself, caused no problems and simply went about his life. Two of his neighbours were Zoe Ryder, aged 36, who lived on the top floor of the same block, and Nicola Lethbridge, aged 45, who lived on the same floor as Stephen. Both women knew him. Both women knew exactly how vulnerable he was. On the evening of 9th August 2023, Ryder and Lethbridge entered Stephen's flat together. Prosecutor Andrew O'Byrne told the jury that both women had been using substances and had likely also been consuming alcohol before they went to his door. The prosecution's case was that Ryder had targeted Stephen deliberately, identifying him as someone she could exploit and had already been doing so. Lethbridge, the prosecution argued, had gone along with Ryder and participated fully in what followed. Inside the flat, the two women subjected Stephen to a prolonged and violent attack. They accused him of wrongdoing that the police investigation later found had absolutely no basis in fact. Investigators found no evidence whatsoever to support anything the two women claimed about him during the attack, and prosecutors made clear to the jury that the accusations were completely false. Stephen was also robbed during the attack, with items taken from his flat while he was being harmed. What made this case particularly disturbing for everyone involved in the prosecution was the evidence recovered from Nicola Lethbridge's mobile phone. During the attack on Stephen, footage was recorded on her device. The video showed Stephen in a state of extreme distress, partially undressed and bleeding. A female voice could be heard on the footage, making threats about causing him serious physical harm. Scissors were visible in the footage, being used as part of the threats directed at him. Prosecutor O'Byrne described the footage to the jury as deeply distressing. South Yorkshire Police Detective Chief Inspector Tom Woodward, who led the investigation, later said that Lethbridge and Ryder had not only subjected Stephen to physical harm, but had humiliated him throughout the attack in a way that went beyond the violence itself. At some point during the attack, Stephen sustained fatal injuries to his head. An ambulance was called and arrived promptly at 11:38 that evening, but the crew were unable to get inside because Stephen, despite being seriously injured, was unable to reach the front door to open it for them. The fire service arrived at 12:06 in the morning and gained entry to the flat. Stephen was taken immediately to the emergency and critical care department at Northern General Hospital. Medical staff assessed his condition and determined that the head injuries he had suffered were unsurvivable. The decision was made to withdraw life support. Stephen passed away at 6:08 in the morning on August 11, 2023, approximately 30 hours after the attack began. The investigation that followed drew on forensic evidence, mobile phone analysis, and what Detective Chief Inspector Woodward later described as good old-fashioned police work. The footage recovered from Lethbridge's phone was central to the case. Both women were charged with taking Stephen's life and with robbery. Neither woman offered an account that the evidence supported. Both Ryder and Lethbridge appeared at Sheffield Crown Court for trial in May 2024. The jury, made up of 8 women and 4 men, deliberated for just 1 hour before returning unanimous guilty verdicts on both the charge of taking a life and the charge of robbery against both defendants. 6 members of that jury returned to court voluntarily to watch the sentencing hearing. Sentencing took place on June 5, 2024, before Her Honour Judge Sarah Wright. During her remarks, the judge addressed both women directly. She told them that on the night of 9th August, they had gone into Stephen's flat with the clear intention of threatening and attacking him and robbing him, most likely to fund further substance use. She described the attack as brutal, heartless, and despicable, and said they had launched a vicious and extremely violent joint assault on a man who had done nothing to deserve what happened to him. She told them that the purpose of what they did was to steal from him and to humiliate, terrify, and hurt him. Defence barristers for both women presented mitigation to the court. Ryder's barrister described a childhood marked by severe neglect and abuse at the hands of both parents, and said she had been introduced to substances by her mother at the age of 12. Lethbridge's barrister told the court that his client came from a damaging background that had left her vulnerable, and that she would not have been involved had she not been led by someone more criminally inclined. Judge Wright listened to all of it. Then, she sentenced both Ryder and Lethbridge to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years each before either could be considered for release. Both women also received 13-year concurrent sentences for the robbery. Stephen's friend, Mary Jones, read a statement to the court that described the impact of losing him. She said she still sometimes found herself expecting him to come round for a visit, before remembering that he was gone. She said the manner of what had happened to him and the footage that had been recorded during the attack were things she and others who loved Stephen would carry with them for the rest of their lives. She said she would love him and miss him forever. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves away from Sheffield's residential streets entirely and into the world of organised criminal networks, where the woman responsible did not carry out the act herself, but instead built the plan from the ground up, recruited the people to execute it, and set events in motion that ended with a 25-year-old man losing his life in the early hours of an April morning. Case 5. Demi Dunford. Demi Dunford was 29 years old and lived on Derby Street in Heeley, Sheffield. Abdullah Hassan was 25 years old and lived on Callow Drive in Gleedless Valley, also in Sheffield. The two did not have a personal relationship. What they had was a dispute over the supply of controlled substances in the city, and that dispute had been building for several weeks before the early hours of 9th April 2023. South Yorkshire Police later confirmed that Dunford had become engaged in a conflict with Abdullah after issues arose between them over drug supply and territory. According to prosecutors, Dunford was driven not just by the practical dispute, but by a desire to establish her position and prove her status within the criminal world she operated in. The way she chose to do that was to have Abdullah shot. Dunford did not act alone. She recruited 3 men to help her carry out the plan. Those men were Alex Taff, aged 31, from Catcliffe in Rotherham, Andrew Horton, aged 47, and Osai Williams, aged 29. Dunford organised the operation. She worked out how to get Abdullah out of his flat in the middle of the night and arranged for the others to be in position when he came out. The method she used to bring him outside was a phone call. Abdullah received a call from someone presenting themselves as a potential buyer wanting to purchase substances from him. He had no reason to suspect what was waiting for him. He left his flat through the fire exit and stepped into the darkness of Callow Drive. The people Dunford had positioned outside were already there. One of them opened fire. Abdullah was shot in the upper thigh and sustained a fatal injury. Despite attempts to save him, he passed away at the scene. He was 25 years old. South Yorkshire Police launched a major investigation immediately. The evidence gathered included CCTV footage tracking the movements of those involved, forensic material, mobile phone data, and ballistics reports linking the firearm to the shooting. The investigation identified Dunford as the organiser of the entire operation. Prosecutors told Sheffield Crown Court that while only one person had pulled the trigger, all four were responsible for what happened to Abdullah, because they had all played a deliberate and active role in making it happen. Dunford had put the plan together. She had recruited the others. She had set the trap. The court heard that Dunford and Williams had both left Sheffield for London and then Southend-on-Sea after the shooting. When Dunford returned to Sheffield, she was arrested. This was not the first time Dunford had come to the attention of South Yorkshire Police. On the evening of 30 of June 2020, officers received calls from members of the public reporting that shots had been fired through the windows of two properties in Sheffield within minutes of each other. Dunford was later connected to that incident and in 2022 was sentenced to 20 months in prison after pleading guilty to her role in a plan to set fire to the vehicle used in those drive-by shootings. She also received an additional 8 months for possession of a significant quantity of Class A substances. Because of the time she had already spent in custody, she was released at the conclusion of that court hearing. The 2023 shooting of Abdullah Hassan happened after she had walked free. Her older brother, Stephen Dunford, was already serving a life sentence by the time Demi stood trial for Abdullah's death. Stephen had been convicted in 2020 of the attempted taking of a life after he fired indiscriminately into a group of people on a Sheffield street, hitting a 12-year-old boy in the thigh. Judge Jeremy Richardson, who sentenced Stephen, said at the time that he posed immense danger to the public and that he had no idea when or if it would ever be safe to release him. Demi Dunford's trial concluded in December 2025 at Sheffield Crown Court. The jury found her guilty of taking Abdullah's life, along with 2 counts of possession of controlled substances with intent to supply, possession of controlled substances, and possession of a prohibited weapon. Taff, Williams and Horton were all also convicted of taking Abdullah's life. Sentencing took place in January 2026. Demi Dunford was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 31 years. The 4 defendants received a combined total of 118 years between them. Detective Chief Inspector Andy Knowles said after sentencing that those who use firearms to carry out criminal violence in this city will face severe punishment when brought to justice. Abdullah Hassan's family have never spoken publicly about what they lost the night he walked out of his flat and never came back. The next case is the most recent on this list, and it involves a woman who used her position on the street to lure a young man to his fate in a Sheffield park at 4 in the morning, in a plan that was built on a lie so calculated that it took a 16-day trial to fully expose it. Case 6. Rebecca Moore. Sakad Ali was 24 years old. On the night of Saturday 8th March 2024, he was at a friend's flat in the Netherthorpe area of Sheffield, relaxed and playing video games. His family later described him as the heart of their family, someone who was always happy and always smiling, a young man who brought warmth to every room he was in. Just after 4 in the morning on March 9th, Sakad received a call from an unknown number. The person on the other end was Rebecca Moore, a 25-year-old woman from Upperthorpe in Sheffield. Moore was known to police and was connected to a drug line operating in the area known as the Frank Line, which supplied controlled substances across parts of Sheffield. The court heard that Moore had a serious addiction to crack cocaine and had aligned herself closely with the operation. The call she made to Sakad that morning was not a random one. It was the final step in a plan that had already been put together. Moore told Sakad to come and meet her at Ponderosa Park, a public green space in the Netherthorpe area, a short distance from where he was staying. The promise she made to get him there was a sexual encounter. Sakad had no reason to know what was waiting for him. He left the flat and walked to the park. Already positioned in the darkness of the park were two teenage boys, Barney Griffin, age 17 at the time, and Jack Douglas, age 16 at the time. Both were drug dealers connected to the same Frank line. Both were armed with large bladed weapons. The prosecution told the court that the motive was territory. Moore, Griffin and Douglas believed Saccad was selling substances on their patch, and the three of them had put together a plan to deal with that. When Saccad arrived at the park, Griffin and Douglas came out of the darkness and launched an attack on him. Saccad begged them to stop. Despite that, the attack continued until his attackers fled the scene, leaving him in the park alone. Despite the efforts of paramedics who arrived after members of the public raised the alarm, Saccad passed away in Ponderosa Park shortly after 5 in the morning. He was 24 years old. South Yorkshire Police surrounded the park quickly after receiving calls from the public. Officers gathered witness accounts from people who had seen those involved, and that information helped investigators identify Moore, Griffin and Douglas as the three responsible. CCTV footage proved critical in tracking the movements of all three before and after the attack. Forensic work also played a significant role, with blood recovered near Oxford Street matching Griffin's DNA. The investigation moved quickly. On the morning of Tuesday 12th March, Griffin and Douglas handed themselves in to police custody. Moore's arrest came separately and was captured on a body-worn camera carried by the officer who approached her. When the officer came up to Moore, she gave a false name. She told him her name was Lauren Smith and gave a different age. The officer remained calm and waited while a photograph of Moore was sent through to his phone to confirm her identity. Once it came through, Moore was identified and handcuffed. The body-worn camera footage, which was later shown in court, captured Moore saying no repeatedly as officers detained her. That footage was described by prosecutors as illustrating exactly the kind of person Moore was, someone who had no problem constructing a lie and delivering it straight to the face of the person in front of her, right up until the moment she had no choice left. Griffin and Douglas pleaded guilty to taking Saccad's life and to possession of a bladed article in May 2024. Moore entered a not guilty plea and stood trial at Sheffield Crown Court for 16 days in October and November 2024. She denied being part of the plan that ended Saccad's life. She denied knowing what was going to happen when she called him to the park. The jury did not accept that account. On November 11, 2024, after deliberating for 3 hours and 19 minutes, a jury of 7 women and 5 men unanimously found Moore guilty of taking Saccad Ali's life. Sentencing took place on November 28, 2024, at Sheffield Crown Court before the Recorder of Sheffield, Judge Jeremy Richardson. All 3 were sentenced at the same hearing. Griffin received a minimum detention term of 16 years. Douglas received a minimum detention term of 15 years. Moore was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 15 years. Detective Chief Inspector Ben Wood said after sentencing that Moore had murdered Saccad by deceiving him into coming to the place where he would be attacked, and that rather than admit what she had done, she had forced his family to sit through every detail of a trial. Saccad's family released a statement saying he was a loving son and brother, that he was the heart of their family, and that what had been done to him had broken their lives completely. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes us back further in time to 2008 and to a very different kind of plan, one that was not carried out in the dark of a park, but in broad daylight on a busy Sheffield street, orchestrated by a woman who had spent weeks building a network of people willing to do what she was not prepared to do herself. Case 7. Faria Khan. Nawajid Ali Khan was 30 years old and worked as a chef at a takeaway restaurant called Milan's on Chesterfield Road in Heeley, Sheffield. He had come to England from Pakistan after marrying Faria Khan in an arranged marriage in 1999. The two settled in Sheffield and had 2 young daughters together. By 2007, the marriage had broken down completely. Nawajid moved out of the family home in May of that year. In January 2008, Faria filed for divorce. Nawajid continued working at the restaurant on Chesterfield Road, getting up each morning and going to his job the same as he always had. On the morning of January 27, 2008, he set off for work as usual. He never made it inside. Faria Khan had spent the weeks before that morning building a plan to have her husband attacked. She had made contact through a friend with a group of young men from Sheffield who presented themselves as part of a rap group called Dem Boys. The connection came through an 18-year-old woman named Neelam Kauser, who was a friend of Faria's and was in a relationship with one of the group's members, a 19-year-old named Brian Urachi. Faria wanted Nawajid attacked. A text message sent from Kauser to Urachi and recovered by police during the investigation read that the job involved a man's life and suggested a payment of around £200 for carrying it out. The group agreed. Faria purchased a 4x4 Vauxhall Frontera specifically for what she was planning. On the morning of 27th of January 2008, she drove to Chesterfield Road. The attack happened in public, on a busy street, as Nawajid arrived for his shift. Members of Dem Boys, armed with axes, a hammer and a knife, came at him as he walked toward the restaurant. Nawajid was badly beaten during the assault. Despite the severity of what was done to him, he managed to stagger away from his attackers and move toward the road. When Faria saw him in the street, she drove the Frontera directly at him. Nawajid was struck by the vehicle and left on the ground. Faria then got out of the car and got into a taxi, leaving the scene. Nawajid Ali Khan passed away from the injuries he sustained that morning. He was 30 years old. His two daughters lost their father on an ordinary Sunday in January because their mother had paid people to take him from them. South Yorkshire Police launched a full investigation immediately. The attack had taken place in a public area and had been witnessed by members of the public who were nearby when it happened. Phone records and text messages recovered during the investigation connected Faria Khan, Neelam Kauser, and the members of Dem Boys to the planning and carrying out of the attack. A witness who had been in custody with Kauser prior to the trial told Sheffield Crown Court that she had heard Faria Khan attempting to persuade Kauser to change her account of who had been driving the Frontera at the time it struck Nawajid. During the investigation, Faria Khan admitted to police that she had organised the assault on her husband, but claimed she had only wanted him frightened, not harmed. The jury did not accept that account. The trial at Sheffield Crown Court lasted 8 weeks. Faria Khan, Neelam Kauser, Brian Urachi and Kanu Kangi, another member of Dem Boys, aged 21, were all convicted of taking Nawajid's life. 2 further members of the group, Daniel Moore, aged 23, and Abdiqadar Mohammed, aged 18, were convicted of conspiracy to kidnap and cause serious harm. Sentencing took place on January 30th, 2009, before Judge Michael Murphy. The judge told Faria Khan directly that she had been the prime mover in the crime. He said she had recruited the group and organised the attack to avoid the social and financial consequences of going through a divorce. He rejected her claim that she had been a victim of abuse at Nawajid's hands, saying that Nawajid had done nothing whatsoever to deserve what was done to him. Faria Khan was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. Urachi and Kangi were each sentenced to life with a minimum term of 17 years. Neelam Kauser, who was 18 at the time of the offence, was sentenced to 14 years in prison. Detective Superintendent Carl Sturgis of South Yorkshire Police described Faria Khan after the verdict as an evil and scheming woman. Nawajid's 2 daughters grew up without their father because of a plan their mother put into motion before they were old enough to understand what had happened. Faria Khan has served a significant portion of her minimum term and may at some point face a parole board review. The next case on this list comes from just outside Sheffield city limits, but was heard at Sheffield Crown Court, and it tells the story of a marriage so volatile that one of the couple's own children told the court it was inevitable that one of his parents would not survive it. Case 8. Pauline Castor. Pauline Castor was 44 years old and lived with her husband Kevin Castor on High Hazel Crescent in Catcliffe, a village in the Rotherham area of South Yorkshire. Kevin was 43 years old, a former soldier who had served in the Royal Artillery Regiment. The two had been married for 22 years and had 3 children together. By October 2021, the marriage had deteriorated into something their own family described as toxic. Their son Lewis later told Sheffield Crown Court that both of his parents had struggled with substance misuse over the years, that arguments were a constant feature of the home, and that he believed it was inevitable one of them would not survive the relationship. Kevin's mother described their bond as one of unhealthy obsession and codependency, saying they loved each other, but that the love had become destructive for everyone around them, including their children and grandchildren. On the evening of the 19th of October 2021, neighbours on High Hazel Crescent began hearing raised voices coming from the Castor home. Windows and curtains were open, and a neighbour reported being able to both see and hear what was happening inside. Pauline could be heard shouting at Kevin, with the argument apparently centred around her belief that he had been involved with another woman. At around 8:30 that evening, the same neighbour observed Pauline making repeated stamping motions through the window, directed downward towards something on the floor. That something was Kevin. CCTV footage recovered from a camera belonging to a neighbouring property captured the attack taking place and confirmed what the witness had seen. The footage showed Pauline stamping on Kevin while he lay on the floor. The attack lasted for approximately 20 minutes. After it stopped, Pauline did not call for help. She waited. 1 hour and 40 minutes passed before she contacted the emergency services. When she did eventually call, she told the emergency services that Kevin had taken an overdose of tablets. Paramedics arrived and found Kevin seriously injured at the property. He was taken to Rotherham Hospital. Despite the efforts of medical staff, Kevin Castor passed away later that evening. A post-mortem examination carried out afterward produced findings that made this case medically unusual in a way that would later be central to the sentencing hearing. Pathologist Jamie Robinson confirmed that Kevin had sustained a head injury consistent with being stamped on and subjected to blunt force trauma. However, the post-mortem also revealed that Kevin had consumed a combination of substances, including a fatal dose of the epilepsy medication lamotrigine, along with cocaine and other drug traces. The pathologist concluded that the overdose alone would have been enough to cause Kevin's death, regardless of the physical attack. The combination of both together is what formally caused his passing. Pauline Castor was not arrested immediately. When officers arrived at the scene on the night of October 19th, she had no visible injuries and gave an account consistent with Kevin having overdosed. White powder and tablets were found in the hallway near Kevin's body, which supported that part of her account. 2 days later, on October 21st, she was arrested on suspicion of taking a life, after Kevin's injuries were assessed more carefully and investigators determined they were not consistent with an overdose alone. While the investigation was ongoing and before any charges had been brought, Pauline continued to use social media. In June 2022, she shared a post about Kevin's passing and responded to a comment with the letters OMG. Later that year, she wrote on a post shared by one of her daughters that she missed her husband and would love him forever. A week after that, she commented that he would always be in her heart. She wrote all of this knowing she had attacked him the night he died. At Sheffield Crown Court in April 2023, Pauline Castor stood trial for Kevin's murder. On the third day of the trial, April 19th, she changed her plea to guilty. Sentencing took place the following day before the Recorder of Sheffield, Judge Jeremy Richardson. The judge described the circumstances as both tragic and extremely unusual. He acknowledged the toxicology findings directly, telling the court that, regardless of what Pauline had done to Kevin physically, he would have passed away from the overdose within minutes in any event. He said she had not intended to cause his death, but had intended to cause him serious harm. He noted the relationship had been comprehensively wretched for both of them. Despite all of that, the law was clear. Pauline Castor had attacked her husband as he lay dying, and she had done nothing to help him for an hour and 40 minutes afterward. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Given the exceptional circumstances of the case, the judge set the minimum term she must serve before being considered for release at 7 years and 3 months, less the 170 days she had already spent on remand. Judge Richardson reminded her as she was sentenced that a life sentence never ends, even if a person is eventually released on licence. Kevin's mother said in her statement to the court that no mother should have to identify the body of her son, and that the day she did so would stay with her forever. She described Kevin as a happy child who had always been smiling, and said that a part of her died the day he did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Pauline Castor's case was defined by a relationship that had slowly fallen apart over decades. But the case you are about to hear involved two women who turned on someone outside their relationship entirely, luring a woman they knew to her death over something as small as a piece of jewellery. Case 9. Penelope Brownley and Justine Waywright. Penelope Brownley was 45 years old, and Justine Waywright was 58 years old. The two women were in a relationship and lived together in a ground floor flat on Britannia Close in Barnsley, South Yorkshire. Claire Louise Smith was 42 years old and moved in the same social circles as the couple. She was described by those who knew her as someone whose life had been difficult, but who had been making real progress in the months before she lost it. She had stopped drinking alcohol, she was on a methadone program, and she had housing. The prosecutor at Sheffield Crown Court told the jury that in the period before her passing, there was evidence that Claire's life was on the up. On the afternoon of the 18th of May 2018, Claire spent time with friends who noticed nothing wrong. By 4 in the morning the following day, she was dead, found by members of the public off Union Street in Barnsley. Her body left in the open, just yards from the flat where Brownley and Waywright lived. The chain of events that led to Claire Smith's passing began with a gold necklace belonging to Penelope Brownley. The necklace was worth several £1,000s. At some point it went missing, and Brownley became convinced that Claire either knew who had taken it or had taken it herself. Waywright shared that belief. Together, the two women decided to get answers, and the way they chose to do that was to get Claire to the flat on Britannia Close and make her talk. CCTV footage recovered during the investigation showed Claire getting into Waywright's car. That was the last time she was seen alive and unharmed. What happened inside the flat on Britannia Close was established through a combination of forensic evidence, CCTV footage, and witness testimony from neighbours. Multiple neighbours told the jury at Sheffield Crown Court that they heard loud and angry exchanges coming from inside the flat that evening. They heard screaming. They heard someone pleading with the attackers to stop. They heard Claire saying she knew nothing about the chain and begging them to believe her. The attack continued regardless. Brownley and Waywright subjected Claire to a prolonged and sustained beating inside the flat. The weapon used was a pickaxe handle. The assault continued despite Claire's pleas and despite her denials. When it was over, they needed to move her body. CCTV captured both women after the attack carrying a carpet out of the flat. Prosecutors told the jury that the carpet had been used to transport Claire's body from inside the flat to the patch of ground off Union Street where she was found. Blood smears were found on the doorstep of the flat, undermining the defence's claim that Claire had left the address on her own. A police sniffer dog later picked up traces of blood both at the location where Claire's body was found and on the doorstep. Claire had 74 external injuries. A post-mortem examination found 17 facial lacerations so deep that bone was visible beneath them. She had fractures to her spine, her ribs, her elbow, and her left leg. The prosecutor told the jury plainly that there was no way any of those injuries were self-inflicted. Both Brownley and Waywright denied murder at Sheffield Crown Court when they faced trial in November 2018. Their defence claimed that some of Claire's injuries had been caused by herself, and that, after she left the flat, she had been attacked by an unknown person who had caused the fatal harm. The jury did not accept that account. After deliberating for more than 2 hours, they found both women guilty of murder. Cries were heard from the public gallery when the verdicts were delivered. Sentencing took place on the same day, 16th November 2018, at Sheffield Crown Court. The judge was Jeremy Richardson. He addressed both women directly and made clear exactly what he thought of what they had done. He told them they were two brutish women who had demonstrated a ruthless capability to visit relentless, extreme violence on a defenseless woman, despite her pleading for them to stop. He told them they were callous and cruel, and that their conduct bordered on the sadistic. Both Brownley and Waywright were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years each. Between them, they received a combined minimum of 52 years behind bars. Detective Inspector Mark Orton of South Yorkshire Police said after sentencing that the attack had been motivated by a suspicion about a stolen necklace that Claire denied having any knowledge of, and that the pair had used extreme levels of violence to try to extract information from a woman who could not give them the answers they wanted because she did not have them. Claire Louise Smith was found on a patch of open ground in her hometown in the early hours of a Saturday morning. She had 74 injuries on her body. She had been beaten with a pickaxe handle. She had begged two women to stop, and those women had not stopped. The life she had been quietly rebuilding for herself ended on the floor of a flat in Barnsley because of a gold chain she knew nothing about. Brownley and Waywright targeted a woman they knew over something they believed had been taken from them. But the final case on this list is different in almost every way. The two people responsible were teenagers. Their victim had never wronged them, and while they were carrying out the attack, they stopped to take photographs of what they were doing. Case 10. The Hartlepool Snapchat Murder. Angela Wrightson was 39 years old and lived alone in a house on Stephen Street in Hartlepool. She had struggled with alcoholism for years and was known in the local area as someone who was lonely, isolated, and vulnerable. Neighbours described her as kind. She was physically frail and spent most of her time at home. Because she was known to buy alcohol and cigarettes for teenagers who came to her door, her home had become something of a gathering point for young people in the area looking for a place to drink. That reputation, and the access it gave others to her, is what led directly to her passing. On the evening of December 8, 2014, two teenage girls visited Angela's home on Stephen Street. One was 13 years old, the other was 14. Both were living in care at the time. Both had experienced significant trauma and instability throughout their childhoods. They went to Angela's that evening to get her to buy alcohol and cigarettes for them, which she did. CCTV footage from a nearby shop captured Angela buying cider while the girls waited at her home. She returned at around 7:30 in the evening. That footage showed she had no visible injuries at that point. Sometime after she walked back through her front door, the two girls began attacking her. What followed lasted for several hours. The weapons used were items found inside Angela's own home. A shovel, a wooden baton measuring 18 inches long with screws embedded in it, a CRT television, a coffee table. Angela was struck repeatedly with all of them. She begged the girls to stop throughout the attack. They did not stop. At around 9 in the evening, one of the girls paused the attack long enough to take a photograph of Angela and post it on Snapchat. In the image, Angela could already be seen with serious facial injuries. The attack then continued. At around 11 that night, the girls left the house. They returned at 2 in the morning to check whether Angela was still alive. At some point during the evening, a message sent via Facebook from someone outside the house urged one of the girls to smash Angela's head in and kill her. The person sending the message laughed. After the attack, one of the girls called 999. Officers later listened to the recording of that call. Both girls could be heard laughing on the line as they complained about being cold outside while they waited. When paramedics arrived at Stephen Street, they found Angela's body slumped in her front room. The room was described as being in a state of devastation. Blood covered the walls and floor. Angela was half naked. Ornamental pebbles from inside the home had been poured over her body. A post-mortem examination confirmed she had sustained 103 separate injuries. 80 of those injuries were to her head alone. Cleveland police launched a murder investigation immediately. The two teenage girls were identified and arrested. Both came from backgrounds marked by abuse, neglect, and time spent in the care system. One had been arrested just 2 months before the attack for assaulting care home workers. Evidence gathered during the investigation included the CCTV footage from the shop, digital evidence from the Snapchat post taken during the attack, the Facebook messages sent to one of the girls during the assault, and the 999 recording. Both girls were charged with taking Angela's life. The first trial began in 2015. It was suspended midway through after identifying information about the defendants was shared widely on social media, which the court ruled had made a fair trial impossible at that point. A retrial was ordered. In early 2016, the second trial took place at Leeds Crown Court before Mr. Justice Globe. Over the course of several weeks, the jury heard full details of what had happened inside Angela's home that night. Prosecutors described the level of violence as hard to imagine. When the jury returned their verdicts in April 2016, finding both girls guilty of taking Angela's life, one of the mothers of the defendants left the courtroom as the verdict was read out. Both girls cried. Sentencing took place on 7th April 2016. Because both defendants were under 18 at the time of the offence, the mandatory sentence under English law was detention at His Majesty's pleasure, which is the equivalent of a life sentence for those below the age of 18. Mr. Justice Globe fixed the minimum term each girl must serve before the parole board can consider their release, at 15 years each. The judge had already made clear during the trial that he considered the case to be one of the most serious he had encountered, given the sustained and prolonged nature of the attack and the complete absence of remorse displayed throughout. The girl, who was 13 years old at the time of the attack, became, at that point, the second youngest female convicted of murder in British legal history. Following their conviction, legal proceedings continued for years around one specific issue: their identities. Reporting restrictions were in place during the trial because both defendants were minors. When those restrictions automatically expired upon both girls turning 18, their legal teams applied to the High Court for lifelong anonymity. In February 2021, Mrs. Justice Tipples granted both girls permanent injunctions, preventing them from ever being identified in connection with the attack on Angela. In her ruling, the judge said she was satisfied that there was a real and immediate risk of serious physical harm to one of the girls if her identity were ever revealed. Both are now known publicly only as D and F. Neither can be named, described in identifying ways, or connected to the case in any publication. Angela Wrightson had 47 criminal convictions of her own. She had spent time in prison. She had never worked. By every measure, her life had been difficult. In the weeks before she was taken, those who knew her said she had been making small steps forward and seemed to be in a more stable place. None of that mattered to the two people who came to her door on the evening of December 8th, 2014. She let them in because she always did. She bought them alcohol because she always did. And then, for reasons that were never fully explained in court, they spent hours taking her life while she asked them to stop. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.